Well, good evening, and it's absolutely wonderful to be here in Little Rock, and I had a great day touring the William Jefferson Clinton Presidential Library. My wife Ann and daughter Cassidy are here with me, and Skip, thank you for hosting me. When I went through the library today, there was a quote on the wall. I went to look at the conservation history, the environmental history part of the museum, and here's a quote that Bill Clinton said that's here in the library. He said, "If there's one thing that should always unite us as a community across the generations, across parties, across time, it is the love of the land." And Bill Clinton certainly has one of the great records in environmental history. If you think about that team of Clinton and Al Gore and Babbitt, and an extraordinary EPA in those years. When we rank president's conservation environmental record, Bill Clinton's one of the top ones. The reason I'm mentioning conservation environmental history, it's because I'm here for my book about the land, Rightful Heritage, Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Land of America. And the idea was, when I grew up, I was born in Georgia, but I grew up in Ohio, and we had a station wagon, Pontiac, and a coachman trailer. And my parents would take us all over the United States because they were teachers and we had months free in the summer. So I got a chance to go to the national parks. I was here at Hot Springs National Park as a boy, but we'd go to Big Bend or the Grand Canyon, Sequoia, Olympics, on and on. And it really changed my life. By the time I was 18, I had never been outside of the United States, but I'd been in all the lower 48 and had camped in many of our great national parks. And I'm coming to you today. This is officially the centennial of the National Park Service. This summer, this August, Woodrow Wilson signed the Organic Act that brought all of these national parks into one organization, although the first national park was Yosemite in 1872 with Grant. We're honoring the system this year. So with those childhood memories in mind, and then let me tell you, as a young adult, one park we didn't go to, but I went on my own, was Theodore Roosevelt National Park in the Badlands. And if you haven't gone, go. It's great to see the bison, the antelope, the prairie dog, villages. It's a spectacular park. And when I was there, I realized that was the birthplace of the conservation movement. It's in Medora, North Dakota, where TR had his big epiphany after he shot a buffalo. There were once 60 million buffalo on the Great Plains, 60 million. When Theodore Roosevelt went looking to hunt one, we were down to about 1,500. And he shot one and did a Native American dance around it. They ate the tongue and the hump, which were considered the delicacies, sent the bison head to a taxidermist in St. Paul, Minnesota, and went to his home, Sagamore Hill, on the wall. That's a typical hunter story, except it took him a week to find that buffalo, and he realized it's going to go extinct soon. And Theodore Roosevelt then created the American Bison Society, Boone and Crockett Club, hunters that are going to bring back the antelope and the deer and the elk and the buffalo. And so when I was there at Medora, I came up with the idea that I was going to write a multiple-volume environmental history of the United States. My first volume would be on Theodore Roosevelt. And TR was born in New York City in 1858. And his mother was from Georgia, and his father was from New York. And what does that tell you, 1858? Civil War looming. His mother was for Jefferson Davis, and his father was for Abraham Lincoln. Young TR remembered their fights in the household, and he would say, while they were arguing about about North versus South, I had a fantasy life in the West. He became our first Western president, even though he was born in New York City. because the West of the 1860s and 1870s was starting to show up in the boys' magazines he wrote. And the West meant natural features of the, Crater Lake, Oregon, or the ruins in Mesa Verde Cliffs. And they were starting to deal with these are these great American heirlooms we have out West. So it caught his imagination as much as the pulp westerns of, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid kind of stuff would also. But also when I say 1858, you need to know that in 1859 is when Darwin publishes On the Origins of Species. Darwin is the revolution. Now, because we were fighting a civil war, a lot of intellectuals, or at least pop culture, didn't gravitate to the impact of Darwin's big study, but the Roosevelt family did. Theodore Roosevelt himself, one of the first leavings, historians spend our life reading other people's mail. That's what we do. We read leavings of the past. So one of the first things Theodore Roosevelt we have of him, besides some talk about writing birds, he was a lifelong ornithologist, is in a childhood scrawl, Theodore Roosevelt writes Darwin's theory of evolution. He's like 7. And then he showed himself evolving from an ape, and his brother from a dog, and his sister from a stork. And he would say, I sit at the feet of Charles Darwin. He worshiped Darwin, Theodore Roosevelt. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., is the founder of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. If you go there, that's Theodore Roosevelt's father that fundraised and got that going. And Theodore Roosevelt's Uncle Robert Barnwell Roosevelt, was very famous in the 1870s and 1880s. He was considered the top naturalist writer in America. He wrote, Uncle Barnwell Roosevelt wrote a book called The Waterfowl of Florida, and he wrote a book called Lake Superior. In fact, when Theodore Roosevelt goes to Harvard to major in what today you would call wildlife biology, it was natural studies, his Uncle Robert Barnwell was very famous for being a Darwinian writer about frogs and eels and all of these kinds of things. In fact, that was his big entree there. My Uncle Robert Barnwell Roosevelt. He's not much known in history because he ended up having 2 wives at the same time. And the Roosevelt family wrote him out of the history books till late. Because Theodore Roosevelt's father, unlike Uncle, in fact, he was such a rogue figure, Robert Barnwell Roosevelt. His novel credit was considered almost pornographic. It was called Petticoat Junction. And he wrote a highly evocative sexual novel that Theodore Roosevelt's father wouldn't let his son read. But Uncle Barnwell Roosevelt was a Dr. Dolittle-like figure who collected all these animals. So you have all of that going on. But by the time Theodore Roosevelt's an undergraduate at Harvard, he writes his first book. Imagine writing a book as an undergraduate. And his first book is The Summer Birds of the Adirondacks. And his love of bird life, but the Adirondacks becomes everything to TR because he had asthma and he was sick. And he dealt with environmental angst of the polluted New York City. But when he'd go to the Catskills or the Adirondacks, his lungs would open up and he'd feel that nature was a curative. And his whole life, Theodore Roosevelt, being outdoors made him feel alive, and he felt like he couldn't breathe in indoor environments. I don't have time to go through Theodore Roosevelt's whole biography when I want to cut to FDR in a minute, but let me tell you that the big moment in TR's life is when he's in Albany. He's a senator from state senator. He's there on the floor, and a runner comes in with the message that's it's from his brother on like a Western Union telegram in Albany, and it says, Theodore, get back home to New York City. Mother is high with fever, and your wife is giving childbirth. She's in labor. He scurried, got a train, made his way into New York City. At night he got in. It's still a gaslit New York. It's Valentine's Day when he gets in there at midnight. And on one floor, his mother has Bright's disease and is burning up like 104 fever. And the other floor of the same building, his wife is giving childbirth and fever. He goes up and down that night, and they both die. He loses his mother and his wife on the same night. Now, the baby lived, Alice Longworth Roosevelt, the great social life, and he almost cut the paper. It's an amazing document. He puts a giant X in his diary, and he writes, "The light has gone out of my life forever." And he has a dual burial of them on Wall Street, the same cemetery Alexander Hamilton's buried, and he goes into deep, utter depression. And at last, his sister says, "Theodore, I will take the baby. You love the West, go West." Not only did he romanticize the West, but he once went grouse hunting in western Iowa, very western Iowa, and then went up to the Red River Valley by Fargo and in Moorhead, Minnesota. And he then took the Northern Pacific, left the baby, took the Northern Pacific Railroad, and went from New York. They were connecting it from Seattle to New York. And he basically got off at where the tracks dumped him off in the Badlands of North Dakota. And he spent his years lost in the wilderness. And he wrote about grizzlies. He wrote about bison. He wrote about the Little Missouri River. He wrote beautifully about the Badlands. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt, as a nature writer, is in the same league as John Burroughs and John Muir, William O. Douglas, somebody who could really write well about the outdoors. Now, as Theodore Roosevelt then, as I told you, this bison idea, now when I say he creates American Bison Society after coming back to New York from his wilderness years in North Dakota, he goes to the Bronx Zoo and raises a genetically perfect herd of buffalo. So the first ones died. You have to feed them certain grasses. This is his project, Theodore Roosevelt. He eventually gets the perfect buffalo raised in the Bronx, gets a train that's meant for show horses and their compartments, so meaning posh, and takes the train to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and goes to a place called Wichita Mountain, where all of the Native American Plains Indians believed when the buffalo had died, those 60 million, they all went down Wichita Mountain. And someday, the buffalo would come back out of Wichita Mountain. Now here's TR with Comanche Chief Quanah Parker going with him and re-releasing these buffalo in the wild, and creates our nation's first game reserve, Wichita Mountain Game Reserve. It's there today. It's a fantastic place. But if you go anywhere in the Great Plains and you see buffalo in South Dakota or Nebraska, or you eat a buffalo burger, or at Ted Turner's ranch in Montana, all of these bison are from that genetic Bronx Zoo herd of Theodore Roosevelt. And he doesn't just do that with bison. As president, it's a presidential quiz question. What's the first time a president writes a book for commercial uses, a commercial publisher as president? Theodore Roosevelt did a book called The Deer Family with Macmillan about the deer of North America. As president, from 1901 to 1909, Theodore Roosevelt saves 234 million acres of wild America on a crusade of conservation for like the quote I gave about Bill Clinton, believing that the love of the land, that Theodore Roosevelt would say, the French have the Louvre and the British might have Westminster Abbey, but we've got the Tetons, we've got Yellowstone, we've got the Great Smokies. Those are our gifts for our children and our children's children. How do you save 234 million acres? And I'm going to connect this at the end here to both FDR and Bill Clinton, but I wanted to tell you the two main mechanisms that Theodore Roosevelt creates, because you see Franklin Roosevelt using it time and again, and then Bill Clinton using it time and again, and that is National Monument designation. It's called, Theodore Roosevelt had gone to the Grand Canyon, surrounded by Rough Riders, the men that served with him in the Spanish-American War in 1898. He's president. He goes to the Grand Canyon, looks out over that divine abyss, and peers in it, and with a press around, and says essentially, do not touch it. God has made it. You will only mar it. Leave the Grand Canyon alone. Powerful environmental speech. A couple years down the pike, Senate's moving to mine the Grand Canyon for zinc, asbestos, and copper. And they do not want it as a national park. National parks, you've got to go through Congress. Theodore Roosevelt did that. Crater Lake in Oregon was a TR National Park through Congress. Mesa Verde, I mentioned before, Theodore Roosevelt National Park through Congress. Wind Cave National Park, there are some. But that was it. They didn't want the Grand Canyon. And Roosevelt grabs in a very elastic piece of legislation called the Antiquities Act of 1906 that his buddy, Congressman John Lacey of Iowa, a Union hero in the Civil War for the Union cause. Lacey is big on saving dinosaur bones and Native American relics because he went all over the West, and what was happening is people were suddenly finding dinosaur bones and people were stealing them left and right. And European museums were coming and grabbing all these Native American pottery shards and antiquities and digging up burial sites and all jewels. And so the idea, the spirit behind the Antiquities Act of '06 said that the President of the United States, on behalf of science for the American people, science, can declare places national monuments for the antiquities. In spirit, it's kind of, a murder site where you have the yellow, plastic around, it's meant for something like that, or an archaeological dig of 6 acres, maybe Native American ruin of, 20 or 40 acres. Roosevelt grabs that and applies it to over 600,000 acres as an executive order saving the Grand Canyon. And the opposition goes nuts on him. And he says, well, they said, that's not what the Antiquities Act's about. And he said, yes, it is. It says science. Show me a better example of erosion at work to study than the Grand Canyon. And then it goes to the courts that it's illegal, but the courts find that it is legal. And the Grand Canyon sticks. And he did other national monuments, executive orders, Devil's Tower, Wyoming, or the redwood trees in Muir Woods, executive order TR. 48 hours before he leaves office, he signs an executive order to save Mount Olympus in Washington State. 48, on his way out, another one. That's one mechanism TR establishes. And the second is 100 years ago, every woman here tonight coming to see me speak would have been wearing a bonnet with an ornamental feather. That was the fashion for women. And there was a feather mafia in Florida. When the birds would be there, the egrets and the heron and the spoonbills, on and on, these little feather mafias, very, very rough crowd, but they'd go out to the bird rookeries and gun down all the birds, pluck one ornamental feather from them and steal all the eggs. So we were destroying these species, and birds were going extinct. There used to be 1 billion passenger pigeons. There are none left today. The last one died in 1913, Martha, at the Cincinnati Zoo. Theodore Roosevelt saw the last report we ever have of a passenger pigeon in the wild was written by Theodore Roosevelt at Pine Knot in Virginia, where he actually saw some and logged an official report about it. But the flamingo used to be all over Florida and had been driven out. The Carolina parakeet or parrot, extinct. During the American Revolution, they fluttered all around the Carolinas and Georgia. So Roosevelt's worried about this, and he gets an ornithologist, talks to him, Frank Chapman, about it. And bottom line is he looks into it and says, what will declare me from declaring the entire Indian River area of Florida a federal bird reservation? And the lawyer said, well, I don't know. He said, I so declare it. And is born Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge. It was started. That was our first one of today. You all, myself, my wife, my child, we own 550 plus national wildlife refuges. 550 now, beginning from Pelican Island, where Roosevelt shut down these bird mafia down there and saved it for the birds. This is an unusual thing TR did because people weren't allowed in this reserve. It was land, coastal land, gifted to a species. And he did 51 federal bird reservations, 50 from the Hawaii to Alaska. Some are the size of West Virginia up in Alaska that he created for animals to survive. Unique in American history. So those are the two big mechanisms. Now he dies, he has an amazing ex-presidency. He goes to Africa, he goes to Brazil and the Amazon, and he dies in 1919. And freeze that for a minute. He's dead. He's gone. Franklin Roosevelt picks up the baton. FDR was born in 1882 in the Hudson River Valley in New York. That becomes his sanctified landscape. TR had the Badlands. FDR loves the Hudson River Valley more than anything. That 315-mile river, guys, is a cavalcade of American history, from West Point to George Washington at Newburgh to Saratoga to Washington Irving and Rip Van Winkle. The greatest naturalist, John Burroughs, of that era lived just across the river from Hyde Park, New York, where FDR was born. And most famously, the Hudson River Valley School of Painters, who did pastoral landscapes. But the big thing from 1882 he's born, so cut into 1892, and into into 1900. The big deal in New York in that period was saving the Adirondacks, where TR wrote the book about the birds, but it was about the water supplies in New York, because New York City was dealing with what happens if a disease hits from contaminated water. It's a big deal. Even today, the water supplies from the Delaware Water Gap or the Catskills and all, it's essential, these aqueducts of fresh water. This is pre-EPA, pre-regulatory. So the idea was you save these forest reserves, get fresh, clean drinking water so you don't get sick. And the Roosevelt FDR's family is big on the Adirondacks for wild. If you pull a map of New York, look how big that Adirondack Park is. It's like Yellowstone out west. It's big. The environmental movement comes out of New York just like it came out of Theodore Roosevelt's Epiphany in the Dakotas. It's big in the Hudson. Now, if you want to understand FDR, you got to understand TR. They were fifth cousins, but FDR always called him Uncle Theodore. But FDR models his life after Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt ran for state senate and represented his district in Albany. FDR does that. Theodore Roosevelt went to Groton Prep School and to Harvard. FDR goes to Groton and Harvard. Theodore Roosevelt's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. FDR's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Theodore Roosevelt's Governor of New York. FDR's Governor of New York. Theodore Roosevelt loves naval history. FDR loves naval history. Theodore Roosevelt wants to be president. FDR wants to be president. Theodore Roosevelt loved conservation. FDR loves conservation. Theodore Roosevelt had a niece he loved named Eleanor Roosevelt. FDR loves Eleanor Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt gave them away in marriage together. And so this conservation is a giant part of understanding FDR. But he wasn't a writer like Theodore Roosevelt about it. But guys, when he runs for politics, upstate New York, a couple things I want you to always remember about Franklin Roosevelt. First off, whenever he filled out a form for occupation, he put tree grower or tree farmer. That's how he made his money. He had a tree plantation on the Hudson. He would take out ads in the New York Times and other papers every Christmas season. Get a Roosevelt Christmas tree, or have a New Deal Christmas. Get a tree from Roosevelt Farms. Many people grew trees. You could see the Catskill Mountains right from his home in Hyde Park, and that kind of tree farming, it was very popular for evergreen trees and all that they would market up there. And wood was needed for railroad ties and for fences. And Morgenthau, his Secretary of Treasury, was an apple tree grower, even though he made money in finance. It was all, the point is, he represented foresters, dirt farmers, poor small farmers. He was a politician representing rural Americans. I've seen angry letters from FDR when somebody would put, like I was introduced today, Rice University. Sometimes people would say he's here from New York City, Franklin Roosevelt. He would say, I'm not from New York. I'm from upstate New York. He never wanted to be associated with the city. And it's important to understand that's his political backing up there. And he learns the language of his constituents. He learned how to talk about soil conservation. He learned about rotating crops. He learned about how do you properly timber. And he, just like TR was into Darwin, FDR hangs out with these scientific foresters. And he really knows forestry, FDR. It's his abiding passion. In addition, Robert Caro wrote a book on Bob Caro did on Robert Moses, the master builder in New York City. Moses wanted recreation for New York City. People go to like Jones Beach, an hour out of the city, Coney Island. You go to the beach, then you come back to the city. FDR hated Moses. FDR's view was to everybody in greater New York, the big New York City, come on upstate, come up the Hudson, spend a long weekend, spend your money. Go camping, go fishing, history tourism, waterfalls, hike or see where George Washington slept. That was what he did as a politician. Now, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, his best friend was Franklin Lane, the Interior Secretary. They were like this. They formed their own Franklin Club in D.C., and Lane's the one who pushes Wilson on creating the National Park Service in 1916. But back to 1919, the World War I's ending, but in 1920, for you political junkies here, what's Franklin Roosevelt do? He runs for vice president on the ticket of James Cox of Ohio. It's Cox and Roosevelt for the Democrats against Warren Harding. FDR went all over, charismatic, good-looking. Women voted for the first time in 1920. Many women's groups thought he was like the perfect speaker. He did well with women's groups, FDR, but they lose in 1920. And FDR doesn't have a job in Washington. He's a tree farmer. He goes back to his farm at Hyde Park. And it's like, what am I going to do with my life? Theodore Roosevelt had been the founder of the Boy Scouts. So FDR runs the Greater Boy Scouts of New York. And with the Greater Boy Scouts of New York, he decides, I'm going to take urban inner city poor kids, and we're going to pay for them to have what would be today you'd call a jamboree. But we'll go up the Hudson to Bear Mountain State Park, and we're going to pay all expenses for these kids from the urban centers, where crime and gangs and slums will come into the great outdoors, camp, fish, canoe, learn Indian woodcraft, and FDR's overseeing all that. He's there interacting, hanging out with all the Boy Scouts he brought up there, very proud of this. And he goes swimming with them. And he contracts the polio virus in the dirty water of Bear Mountain State Park. Now, polio wouldn't manifest itself immediately. It took a few days, but by the time he got the virus, he went up to Campobello up in New Brunswick, right by Maine. That day, he was teaching his sons how to properly put out forest fires on an island that had caught fire, because he had learned all these forest fire principles, because it was important as in upper New York to learn how to control wildfires. But he went back after that outing and had the shakes and felt sick. He went to bed early, put out the lamp without reading, had a migraine kind of laying there, and he couldn't sleep very well, but by the time the sun rose, he had no feeling in the lower half of his body. Zilch. Eleanor Roosevelt comes to his side. She's with him there like a Florence Nightingale figure, because he was in utter terror. Talk about the man who has nothing to fear but fear itself. He was a ball of fear. And their marriage had been strained. He had an affair with Lucy Mercer. She had found the love letters. Their marriage wasn't doing well, but she put all that aside and rallied to him. They got him into a hospital in New York. Now he's back at Hyde Park, back on the Hudson, sitting there in August of 21, and nobody wants to see Franklin Roosevelt, because people thought you can get polio, you can get contaminated. You don't want to hug somebody that's a polio. You don't want to hang. So all of his friends dry up. He's left there by himself with the woodchucks and the blue jays and the scenic Hudson, and he gets some solace from the outdoors life and the familiarity of that pastoral landscape he so loved. But he does hook up with a couple of buddies, one named John Lawrence, but most importantly for my story, Manswell Crosby from Rhinebeck, New York, childhood friend who now was the top ornithologist of upstate New York. And FDR and Crosby go to Florida and disappear into their wilderness like TR went to the Badlands. They go into the Everglades. And they look to find themselves in the Everglades. And the Everglades that Bill Clinton did so much to restore, the Everglades get saved by Franklin Roosevelt in 1934 as president. But on this journey in the 20s, he starts saying this is the amazing and it should become a national park. And he's writing about wild Florida. Not only does he push for the Everglades to become a park as president, he literally creates the state park system of Florida. And by executive order, he saves Fort Jefferson or the Dry Tortugas in the Keys area, which is a national park today. But he comes back to New York, and that he's being like reborn. That water makes him feel better. He feels a little better. He buys in Warm Springs, Georgia, his polio resort retreat to swim in the thermal waters at Warm Springs. Again, he's running a tree plantation at Warm Springs, one in Hyde Park, one in Georgia. Forestry, always talking to farmers of one kind or another. And to compress the story, you need to know his big comeback is learning to walk. And he has his one son on one arm, and then he gets like a cane, and he learns. He hurt him, but he learned to go like from the wall there to here, and he would do this motion, and he'd practice it at Hyde Park just for his big moment when he has to introduce Al Smith, the great governor of New York, at a huge election event in Madison Square Gardens. And here he comes, Franklin Roosevelt, and the audience was like, whoosh. And you're just sitting there, oh my God, is he going to make it? And then he finally clutched on it once he got a hold of a podium. But then that voice, you all know that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. That he gives that speech in that voice. And it's magnificent speech. And this is not apocryphal. He gets an over 1 hour standing ovation. 1 hour. And the New York Times next day goes, oh my God, Roosevelt steals the show. He's back. And not only is he back, from there he runs for governor of New York and wins in 1928. And then he runs again, governor of New York in 1930. And his big thing as governor is conservation, of taking unemployed men and finding them ways to plant trees, rehabilitate land, set up new parks, greenery, city beautiful, doing all this sort of public works with the unemployed of what by 1929 is the Great Depression. And we always focus on the stock market crash. Well, FDR didn't really care a whole lot about Wall Street crashing. He cared about the farmers of America. He cared about the people that lived in rural America. He thought that being rural farmers were the salt of the earth Americans. But because he was so urbane, we often don't see that. But at that point, he runs in 1932. Of course, he beats Herbert Hoover. He launches his New Deal. He claims he's going to put all these unemployed men to work. He gives his famous inaugural speech in March 1933. And sure enough, out of his own mind, he comes up with an idea of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. It's the heart and soul, the spiritual heart of the New Deal, where he employs eventually 3.4 million men. From 1933 to 1942, men getting paid $1 a day, wearing a uniform, getting up at bugle call to plant nearly 3 billion trees across America. 3 billion. The CCC is Roosevelt's tree army. And they go everywhere. Suddenly you're dirt poor and have no money. You're living in Newark, New Jersey. You'd find yourself out in Zion in Utah. You know, you're growing up poor in Memphis, Tennessee, and suddenly you find yourself, you know, up in the Tetons of Wyoming, doing roads, building visitor centers, doing reservoirs, stocking ponds, building areas that are attractive to geese and duck, doing water, doing bird protection, on and on and on about revitalizing the land of America, because the land was burned out in the Great Depression. The Great Plowup had killed the Midwest. The Dust Bowl drought was destroying the Great Plains. Our lands, the South had clear-cut so much, and the CCC and other programs, soil conservation districts of U. Bennett, and the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, would come in with some of the engineering feats, and they try to resave American heritage. Hence the title of my book, Rightful Heritage, from a speech he gives in Cleveland, Ohio, FDR, about the waterways and lakes and forests and features. They belong to us, the American people, in a TR-like fashion. He uses those Antiquities Acts just like TR had taught him to. And he does it in a lot of different places. Can you guys believe this? In 1938, FDR disappears to the Galapagos Islands for over like 24 days to search the footsteps of Darwin. Just like TR left. Disappeared for weeks in World War II, 38. The war is coming, and he goes away to the Galapagos to find new flora and fauna. I got in first time in the papers of Dr. Waldo Schmidt at the Smithsonian Institute, who went with them, and they discovered a new kind of burrowing shrimp, a new kind of little fish. This is Franklin Roosevelt. He would sign executive orders. I mean, he'd go down to Port Aransas, Texas on the Gulf. FDR tried to make all of Gulf Texas a national seashore. But he went down there and went tarpon fishing, caught one of the Silver King giants, and that's where the whooping cranes spend their time, signed an executive order, Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. Did one mule shoe in Texas for the sandhill crane. Do you know my state where I live in Austin? He built the entire state park system of Texas is built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. They would use native stone, native woods, build structures. The WPA does the Riverwalk in San Antonio. They build the Dallas park systems. This is everywhere in the United States, guys. Do you know that June 6, 1944, D-Day? Do you know where Franklin Roosevelt was the days leading up to D-Day on June 4th, let's say, and before? But Charlottesville, Virginia. You know why? Theodore Roosevelt kept a place there in Charlottesville, Virginia called Pine Knot to go bird watching. You can go tour it now. It's a private foundation. Pine Knot. TR would disappear there. FDR goes to Charlottesville to bird watch before D-Day and to get away from the press so they don't notice something weird going on or something big happening. He comes into D.C., goes to bed, has to make his D-Day announcements. Do you realize on June 6, 44, he doesn't cancel the meetings with Amon Carter of Fort Worth and signs into the federal deed and accepts it for Big Bend National Park? There are photos of FDR with maps of Big Bend National Park on D-Day because he wanted to anchor the border with Mexico down there on the Rio Grande River. Up north on the Canadian border, he went to Glacier Park and went and gave our first radio broadcast from Glacier ever from a national park, and did a live nationwide radio broadcast from Glacier and said there's nothing more American than the national parks. After the Galapagos trip, he found out that the Channel Islands of California were the Galapagos of America, executive order to save them. A woman named Ravana Hamilton Hoyt comes in, and Hoyt is from Pasadena, founder of the Rose Bowl Parade, or was a big person with that in women's garden clubs. She lost her husband and found God looking at the sky in the Mojave and wanted to save the Joshua trees, those gnarled, somewhat grotesque to some people's trees out there. And so she gets some Harold Ickes. There's a Harold, the original, the one who worked with Bill Clinton. And, one of the hard things is it's Ickes or Ickis. They're used two different ways by each member of the family. But Hamilton Hoyt gets a meeting with Roosevelt in 33, and shows him photos. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, if you want Franklin to get something done, a park preserved or land, just show him photos. He's a sucker for photographs. She shows them all, and he goes, okay, your million-acre park, done. And she was jarred. She said, well, Mr. President, it's a little, the railroad is, Union Pacific or whatever is claiming some of this land, and then there are these mining outfits that are claiming these. And he said, that's for lawyers. They do it later. I've just gave you your million-acre park. It's Joshua Tree National Park today, huge recreation area. It did go through lawyers. It did take a couple years longer, and that million acres went down to 700,000 acres, but Roosevelt got it done. Roosevelt did big things, FDR, with forest. Stalin, well, I'm not used to quoting in public forums, but Stalin said, rightfully, Winston Churchill negotiates with you and he tries to sneak his hand in your pocket and he quietly pulls out a coin. And FDR greets you smiling, jams both hands in and pulls everything out all at once. He'd do big deals all the time, guys. He wanted all of our beach lands, coastal areas, as national seashores. He thought nobody should own a beach and that it needed to be public land. So he created the first national seashore in executive order at Cape Hatteras. But then that was in 37. In 37, the blowback came because he tried to pack the Supreme Court, as you all know. Do you imagine the hubris of trying to pack the Supreme Court, by the way? I mean, here you win a big election. You got 9 Supreme Court justices, and some of these executive orders that both Roosevelt's like ginning out, they're saying this is not legal. Some of the Supreme Court was challenging them. Roosevelt's solution is to put on 6 new Supreme Court rubber stamp New Dealers. That's not a pipe dream. He goes for it. He puts all of the political capital he has in it. And of course he fails. But I want you to think about that kind of mind that would try something like that instead of being stymied. And of course, he gets on. His big pick is William O. Douglas and gets him on the Supreme Court. And Douglas becomes the biggest environmental hero in American political life from the Supreme Court in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Douglas is a huge figure. FDR goes to Olympic Peninsula in Washington, deciding what to do with the land, should it be timbered or not, sees a hillside clear cut, poor forestry, you don't clear cut a mountainside and strip it bare, says out loud, who did that? Whoever did that, I hope they're roasting in hell, and pushes to create Olympic National Park, saving the rainforest there, connecting it with TR's Olympic, Mount Olympus, which I mentioned earlier. On and on, guys. Mammoth Caves, Great Smoky Mountains, Isle Royale in Michigan, Utah Capitol Reef. I mean, the CCC, and he would take little places and quadruple the landmass. Made ski resorts for Idaho and Vermont to bring them winter recreation money. But I'm going to end and pivot to Clinton by just telling you, FDR, this will give you an example on the wildlife protection. I mentioned the buffalo and TR. Pearl Harbor, early December 1941, Roosevelt responds to Rosalie Edge, a very liberal New Deal woman in New York City, who writes him that the 10th Mountain Division is disrupting the trumpeter swans in Henry's Lake, Idaho. 15 miles west of Yellowstone, these trumpeters would spend their winter there because the Henry's Lake didn't freeze. So they would stay instead of wintering down to the Gulf or whatever. And she said the 10th Mountain Division, which cost like $24 million, that was our training for ski troopers in World War II, artillery training, cross-country skiing, and the rest. That's where they were training. And this woman wrote him and that they'll go extinct. Well, the trumpeter swan's not going to go extinct on FDR's watch. And not only does he respond to her, but he writes Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, a former bull mooser, by the way. Harold Ickes was a former bull mooser. Henry Wallace was a former bull mooser, meaning TR's ardent supporters are key cabinet people with FDR. But he writes Stimson, December 41, Dear Henry, I have now found out about the war between the U.S. Army and the trumpeters. And I've looked into the matter, and the verdict is in favor of the trumpeter swans. The U.S. Army must denest. Sincerely, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He boots them to Camp Hale, Colorado. We have to shut down a $24 million facility, taxpayers' dollar. Is he nuts, FDR? He's making a broad statement to the War Department, and he did this all over. You're not gouging the public lands because of World War II. Theodore and I have built this system of preservation, and that's part of what we're preserving in World War II. We're not going to go do clear cutting and mining and ruining and shooting animals and trespassing and doing illegal activities just because of World War II. So the trumpeter swans is something to tell about Stimson. Wake up. We're going to not, because a lot of times military would go into these national forests and do different things. Finally, you know, the great wartime conferences, I found letters. Ann and I brought our kids up to Hyde Park to be at the FDR Presidential Library. We lived up there 2 summers. I found letters that he writes right after Tehran to the Shah of Iran and the King of Saudi Arabia. They're different letters, personalized, but the gist of them are this. Let's just say to the Shah of Iran, quite a country you have there, but I'm terribly worried that you have soil erosion and you're sadly in need of a reforestation project, and I'm here to volunteer to help you. We had a Dust Bowl here, and I had to do a lot of things, so I'm willing to help you so you can make it in the post-World War II world, and tap on me. I'll come and help you. He could not stand seeing badly abused land, because abused land for FDR meant poverty. It was what happened in the Great Depression. You go to Haiti today, it's deforested, you're guaranteed to poverty. The countries thriving in the world today, truly thriving with standard of living, countries with clean air, clean water. It's Canada, it's the United States, New Zealand, Australia, Norway, Sweden. You know the countries that have strong conservation. That's what Roosevelt's, both of them, are about, taking care of the land. Last thing he did was trying to promote with old Gifford Pinchot, chief head of the forestry for Theodore Roosevelt, now in his 80s, had, I think, 4 heart attacks, still alive, and FDR and Pinchot go in cahoots to make, when the UN gets created, they're going to create what they come up with the slogan, global conservation as a basis for permanent peace. Global conservation is the basis of permanent peace. And they wanted global laws for water pollution, tree cutting, wildlife killing, because it doesn't do any good, guys, for one country to protect birds and the other country kills them. It doesn't do any good for one country not to pollute the river when the other country pollutes the river. So what we call today global environmentalism, like you see with climate talks and Kyoto and all that, has a genesis there with FDR, trying to get that as a key point, and he dies. April 12, 1945. The Truman crowd thinks FDR went too far in all this conservation. They have no stomach to promote it with the UN, which is hard enough to create, and it dies on the vine. Just like Taft, when he came in, thought TR had gone too far in conservation. Harold Ickes, after FDR is buried where he was born and lived at the home in Hyde Park, Ickes said, we got to do something that really meaningful. It's all about trees for Franklin. So when the UN meets in San Francisco to be founded, all the delegates get there to Nob Hill, and then they all go to Muir Woods, to the great redwood trees in Marin County, and they go deep into the cathedral and have a service at Muir Woods for FDR, amongst the trees, the giants, which he was so synonymous to. Now, and because I know I've gone over my limit here, but you can tell I have a lot of passion for this subject, that Bill Clinton continued using wildlife refuges and national monuments in his presidency. Under Bruce Babbitt, I rank Babbitt as one of the top 3 or 4 interior secretaries in American history. And what he got to do, you know Babbitt's story, but as he tells it, Babbitt knew all about this Antiquities Act, the way the Roosevelts would use it. So he went to Bill Clinton and he put on a note card all of the national monuments TR created and said, Mr. President, here are the national monuments Theodore Roosevelt, and you look at this list, and here are yours. You know, it was like a near blank card. You got the executive power. Second term Bill Clinton was extraordinary on land and conservation, most particularly with in Utah, where he put aside 1.8 million acres blocking development of mining there for the Grand Staircase Escalante. Used up so much political capital. It's one of the great parks in America. It's wind-carved erosion, Native American artifacts, spectacular wilderness area. We haven't still caught up with the importance of what Clinton did with Grand Staircase Escalante. It is, to give you an idea of how big it is twice the size of Yosemite. He was so hated for doing it in Utah. Some of you Clinton fans here probably know he had to go and deliver the speech creating it in Arizona because the Utah was so angry about it. Go out there sometime. It's a great way, and I know President Clinton's very thrilled about it, but he placed over 3 million acres of federal lands off limits in our national forest as roadless areas. National forests are, unlike monuments or parks, can be timbered depending. So if Trump comes in, they're going to go do heavy duty timbering, where Hillary Clinton would be much more modest or much more conservation driven. But Bill Clinton went so far as to promote 3 million acres of federal lands. They ended up in the end protecting 84 million acres also of coral reef, the Clinton administration. They did wetlands restoration in the Everglades that I've been talking about. They did 14 heritage rivers that Bill Clinton did to protect. But I wanted to focus on this roadless idea and tell you the first real wilderness, meaning a big area of land where no roads are allowed. Franklin Roosevelt, because a sucker for pictures, an unknown photographer named Ansel Adams, a child, took photos of a Kings Canyon country in the high Sierras, made a booklet like this, a little one about, with pictures of it, those beautiful black and white photos of Ansel Adams, got it to Harold Ickes, who got it to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt said, I'm going to keep it. He wouldn't give it back. He said, this is unbelievable. And he went and fought and got it. Horrible. This was front page news story regularly. Kings Canyon, California. It's a national park today. Roosevelt and Harold Ickes fighting to get it saved as a roadless wilderness national park. Because some people like Aldo Leopold, a great conservationist, was saying roads create problems. Edward Abbey called Zion National Parking Lot. Some of you go to Yellowstone and all that traffic, that we need pure wilderness. Roosevelt does the Kings Canyon, California. It's a big first step of doing that roadless. And you know what he said when he did it to Harold Ickes? He said, Harold, I'm never going to get to see any of this. He said, well, what do you mean? He said, with no roads, I can't get anywhere because of the wheelchair. So he saved it, even though he never would be able to see it. Well, then this idea of wilderness takes hold, and famously Lyndon Johnson does the Wilderness Act of 1964. But it's Bill Clinton who uses up incredible amounts of capital to put 1/3 of our national forests off limits for road building, logging, oil and gas. 1/3 of our national forests. Grab a map and see how much land that is. It's really quite a remarkable. And he sided and fought with the spotted owl controversy up in the Pacific Northwest, which was a big deal because just like was symbolic, it was about, Bill Clinton said, we're going to make the Endangered Species Act stick. It's real. And his administration fought for that very tooth and nail. Finally, I wanted to end by by telling you the big legacy that I think we haven't caught up with Bill Clinton, and what differentiates him somewhat from TR and FDR in the environmental presidency is Bill Clinton is the leader of what today we're calling environmental justice, about the very fact that we too often have industrial plants and landfills in poor places. And you want to see people getting sick, cancer alleys, dump yards, the amount of African-American, Latino communities where we put all of our industrial sludge and waste in. The awakening of that, I mean, Cesar Chavez did some of that with pesticides, and Martin Luther King at the time of Memphis, when he was shot, was talking a little environmental justice. But it comes to fruition during the Clinton years. The Environmental Protection Agency, I think, was at its best and most vigorous during the Clinton years. And of course, you have the beginnings of Clinton and Gore and the warmings of climate change that kick in that second term of Bill Clinton that today are one of the chronic plagues of our planet and might be something that's going to disturb us more and more in the coming decades. So I think when you think about who to be president in 2016, think about the lands of America. Think about this rightful heritage. Don't let people come in and do willy-nilly pipelines and ruining public lands that have been preserved under. And there's a sagebrush rebellion out west now. People in Utah that Zion belongs to me. They weren't saying that when FDR was pouring money in there to quadruple the size of Zion, create Cedar Breaks, because Utah needed the recreation money. Roosevelt funded all the roads of Utah and all, but now there's a kind of a movement. And you saw in Malheur up in Oregon with the kook going in there and taking over a national wildlife refuge, and this kind of thing going on. So it is a bit of a war out there on this. But I'm part of, and I hope you will remember the Roosevelts and Bill Clinton and the fact that we have to keep a vigilance of making America the beautiful, as Bill Clinton said, it's the land in the end, the land of America that is our great heritage. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for some questions. If you will raise your hand, then we will get the microphone to you. Bob, right here, right there. Right, yeah, it's coming right. Yes, sir. The microphone's behind you.
The unemployment continues to be a problem in the United States. Do you think something like the CCC or the WPA is viable in this environment?
Excellent question. Really crucial. Colin Powell thinks so. And many, the idea is, can we take urban unemployed people and give them jobs working at beautification or as a climate corps? People like Bill Clinton was very big on AmeriCorps and Job Corps. How can we do it that's meaningful and real? I think yes. The problem was the CCC had a military feel to it. I don't know if young people today are ready for that kind of up at dawn and because we've created a lot of leisure and electronics, and then these are people, a generation a little hardier in some ways, perhaps. But I think it's a fantastic idea for Hillary Clinton administration. I know people in Fish and Wildlife and in Department of Agriculture are very keen on doing something like this. So it will be in the mix soon. And I think the answer is we should give it a try, figure out how we can do it that's as effective as the New Deal programs were. The CCC had problems, guys. Want to hear one? Kudzu. They planted it all over the South to arrest soil erosion. So I'm giving you the sunny side of the CCC. They made a lot of mistakes, some of their cottonwood planting and all. But on the overall, they did a remarkable job in their building. The craftsmanship of the CCC on buildings and lodges, just utterly remarkable, the rustic architecture.
Yes, we got a question right up here, Art, up here at the front. Wait a second, the microphone's coming at you, Art.
Yeah.
Art, here comes the microphone.
Okay, sure. My question is about raising the consciousness of the environmental movement, so to speak. I think that was on the agenda. You spoke very well about that. But all I read about these days is the EPA being attacked one way or the other, upside down, down, whatever. Even the courts have not exactly been friends of the EPA. So my question is, how do you instill that consciousness when basically it's not really on the agenda? And it certainly hasn't been on the agenda in the presidential race.
Well, you know, when the Newt Gingrich came in 1994 with that big midterm election, Bill Clinton, one thing he did very well by 95 was he saw that the right was going to loot those public lands. That was a big movement, and he blew the whistle on them, believing that most people care about public health, and that he rallied behind and started putting together a great environmental record, because what Bill Clinton communicated very well to people is mothers do not want, or fathers, don't want their kids getting sick. And that's what Rachel Carson did in 1962 when she said public health, that pesticides, it's no longer about saving the Arctic, which, you know, Bill Clinton made sure they didn't drill the Arctic when he was president, but it was it's telling them your kid can get sick if from fracking, or from the wrong kind of factory pollution, or from coal mines, or from. And so you've got to connect it to public health, I think. And also we have to take advantage of things like this is the year of the national parks, to talk about it like we are here today, and recognize what a huge accomplishment the national parks are. I have to tell you, when I speak to conservative groups, if I say the word environmental, they think I'm a tree hugger, and you can feel them back off. If I talk to a conservative group and say, you know, we want to keep your local lake clean, keep the fishing good, keep the woods with game. So there's a bit of a lingo thing going on here. So it's just going to take leadership on this issue. But I don't want to be despairing, guys. We've done an amazing job in America with our national parks, our forests, our monuments, our state parks, EPA, but we constantly have to protect them. And when I hear like Ted Cruz say, we'll abolish the EPA, it's so outrageous to not understand the Environmental Protection Agency is essential. Do they make mistakes? Can we administer it better? Yes, but we've got to honor what the EPA means, and it'll be celebrating its 50th anniversary in 2020. And it's been 50 years of story of great successes, the EPA.
Yes, got a question back there at the back.
At the end, you alluded to what has happened in Malheur and the Sagebrush Rebellion and so forth. And I've thought a lot about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Teddy Roosevelt since this movement has started in recent years. And the challenge basically is constitutional. So in your studies, my question is, and I would really like to look back at this, how much did they look at the constitutional basis for parks and national forests and so forth? And if Teddy and FDR were alive today, how would they respond to this?
Well, let me just answer that this way, because it's a longer question, but and it's a great question. But I will tell you what FDR did when the economy sank. The government went and banks had no money, so he went and bought sub-marginal land for almost no money, meaning burned out land, and then put these workers in it and brought back wildlife areas, brought back duck and geese, and they created the duck stamp. FDR took Ding Darling, a Republican, and FDR brought Republicans into the conservation movement. Here's a liberal Democrat, but his head of biological survey was a staunch anti-New Deal Republican, Ding Darling, but they did this project together. Harold Ickes, Interior Secretary, could have picked anybody. He picked a Republican to work with them. So I think we've got to work together with the Democrats and Republicans where we can. I'm leaving tomorrow to go to Idaho. It's a long ways out there. And I got to go to Twin Falls. I'm going because there's a Republican Congressman Simpson out there who has worked to save Boulder, White Cloud as a wilderness area. He just wanted to make sure hunting and fishing could be there. So here's a conservative Republican in Idaho, congressman, who stepped up and is fighting to save some of that land. So I want to support him because we need both parties. It can't just be a Democratic issue, I think. But I do think the climate change is a game changer, and both Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton and Barack Obama have been talking about it. But how do we, by that meaning, guys, wildlife, here we see Hart antelope range. Well, climate's making the antelope leave that range going somewhere else, or forestry with bug infestation, and the climate's starting to change the grid of our country, so we do need a kind of renewed conservation effort right now.
Okay, we got time for one more question, and then we got to do some book signings.
Thanks for being here. In the book, you mentioned the Lower White River National Wildlife Refuge and the Ouachita River efforts. Can you expand on that, please?
Well, I write about, I don't want to go in huge depth with all that, but I write about, I hope you guys will see in the back of my book, I list all of the places that FDR saved, and it took me a while to compile it all, but a big thing for Franklin Roosevelt is rivers, that in keeping them clean. However, he did dams, and he did the Grand Coulee Dam and the Bonneville Dam and Tennessee Valley Authority for Public Utilities. Those have adverse environmental effects. But he would always try to say, like, okay, if the salmon aren't running up there, he'd create fish hatcheries, or we'll do a recreation area next to them. But a lot of his writings and letters and all is about anti-pollution laws and trying to save wild, scenic rivers across the United States, but it's contradictory because of the damomania in the West, and the verdict's still out on some of those dams. Certainly they did their job for public utilities, but it had an environmental cost. We have way too many dams in the West right now that aren't needed.
Let's thank Douglas Brinkley, and I hope you'll come visit with him and buy this book, Rightful Heritage.
Thank you all. Really enjoyed being here. Thank you.